Jean-Bédel Bokassa was a dictator who ruled the Central African Republic from 1966 to 1979. His tenure encompassed not only extreme greed and personal violence, but also delusions of grandeur unsurpassed by any other African leader. His excesses included 17 wives, a score of mistresses, and an official brood of 55 children. He was prone to towering rages as well as moments of sentimentality. Moreover, over the years he came to develop a reputation for cannibalism. From an early age, Bokassa's life was affected by violence. When he was 6 years old, his father, a petty chief in the village Bubongi, was beaten to death at the local French prefect's office for protesting against forced labor. His distraught mother committed suicide a week later, leaving her 12 children to be orphans. Raised by a grandfather and educated at mission schools, Bokassa was constantly teased by other kids about the fate of his parents. After finishing secondary school, he enlisted in the French army. He went on to achieve a number of accolades in both the Second World War and the war in Indochina. French officers, while recognizing his courage under fire, also knew him to be a vain and capricious personality. But in the rush to independence, Bokassa gained rapid promotion. After serving as a sergeant for 17 years, he left the French army in 1961 with the rank of captain, and was given the task of helping to set up a national army. 3 years later, at the age of 42, he was appointed chief of staff of the CA's 500-man army. Bokassa seized power on the 31st of December 1965, after learning that President David Dacko, a cousin, intended to replace him. From the start, Bokassa's regime was brutal. A former minister was beaten to death because he was deemed not to have shown enough respect to the army in the past. A former head of internal security was executed with extreme cruelty. Dacko was held in solitary confinement for 3 years. Political prisoners and inmates in Garagba prison in Bongi were routinely tortured or beaten on Bokassa's orders, their cries clearly audible to nearby residents. But otherwise, Bokassa's preoccupation was to enjoy the pomp and power of office, and to amass a fortune for himself. He liked to describe himself as an absolute monarch and forbade mention of the words democracy and elections. He promoted himself first to the rank of general and then to marshal, for supreme services to the state. For public appearances he insisted on wearing so many medals and awards that special uniforms had to be designed for him to accommodate them. He delighted in naming after himself a host of schools, hospitals, clinics, roads and development projects, as well as Bongi's new university. The front page of every school, exercise book in the entire country was adorned with his picture. He adored the ceremony of state visits and toured the world a number of times, taking with him large retinues of assistants and distributing gifts of diamonds to his hosts. He controlled all decision-making, every promotion or demotion, every reward or punishment. Ministers were shuffled with monotonous regularity, as often as 6 times a year, to ensure that they did not become a threat. As the telephone system in Bongi hardly functioned, all government officers were required to keep their radio switched on in order to hear intermittent instructions sent directly from the presidential office. Development projects were sometimes started with enthusiasm, then abandoned when Bokassa's interest dwindled if the money was needed for another new idea. After allegations of poor airline connections to the country, he decided that a national airline should be established. Air Centrafrique was duly set up, then promptly collapsed after a few flights. Using government funds at will and fortunes he made from diamond and ivory deals, Bokassa acquired a whole string of valuable properties in Europe, including 4 chateaux in France, a 50-room mansion in Paris, houses in Nice and Toulouse, and a villa in Bern. He built a huge ancestral home at Birengo, 50 miles from Bongi, and ordered a motorway to be built to it. The presidential estate there included private houses and apartments for foreign visitors furnished with reproduction antique furniture and gilt mirrors. He permitted government ministers to make their own fortunes, occasionally chiding them for excessive greed, but willing to overlook corruption when it suited him. He also pampered the army with large salaries and sophisticated equipment, and allowed officers to engage in commercial activities, recognizing that his hold on power depended on the army's loyalty. He packed the presidential guard with members of his own Baka tribe, mainly from his own village, providing them with the best uniforms and equipment. The government's finances were accordingly chaotic. No proper records were kept. Budgets were ignored in favor of ad hoc spending. His sexual proclivities were voracious. He installed wives and mistresses in separate residences, leaving his palace several times, each day to pay them visits, holding up traffic on the way. His principal wife, Catherine, a strikingly attractive woman, whom he first spotted at the age of 13, lived in the Villa Nassa and owned a fashionable boutique in the city center. Another favorite, La Romaine, a blonde cabaret dancer whom he met on a visit to a nightclub in Bucharest, lived in the Villa Colongo, a palatial residence on the banks of the Ubangi River, surrounded by tropical gardens with courtyard and fountains. Most of his wives tended to be known by their nationality. They included the German, the Swede, the Cameroonian, the Chinese, the Gabonese, the Tunisian, and the Ivoirian. The French, keen to ensure that the Central African Republic remained within the French sphere of influence, continued to underwrite Bokassa's regime with financial and military support. In volatile moods, Bokassa frequently picked quarrels with them, occasionally threatening to leave the French fold. In 1969, he announced a move to the east and proclaimed scientific socialism as the government's goal, expecting rewards to flow from the Eastern Bloc, but when they failed to materialize, he reversed course. He abruptly converted to Islam, acting the name Salah Aden Ahmed Bokassa, hoping for Arab funds, but disappointed by the result soon reverted to the Catholic Church. Despite the quarrels, Bokassa's attachment to France remained profound. For his impending coronation, he ordered all the trappings of a monarchy from France. A crown of diamonds, an imperial throne, shaped like a golden eagle, an antique coach, thoroughbred horses, coronation robes, brass helmets and breastplates for the imperial guard, tons of food, wine, fireworks and flowers for the festivities, and 60 Mercedes-Benz cars for the guests. The coronation took place on the 4th of December 1977, at the Palais des Sports Jean-Bédel Bokassa, on Bokassa Avenue, next to the Université Jean-Bédel Bokassa. To the strains of Mozart and Beethoven, wearing a 20-foot-long red velvet cloak trimmed with ermine, Bokassa crowned himself, and then received as a symbol of office, a 6-foot diamond-encrusted scepter. The spectacle of Bokassa's lavish coronation, costing $22 million, in a country with few government services, huge infant mortality, widespread illiteracy, only 260 miles of paved roads, and in serious economic difficulty, aroused universal criticism. But the French, who picked up most of the bill, curtly dismissed all such criticism. The French Cooperation Minister, Robert Galli, who represented Giscard at the coronation, said, "I find it quite extraordinary to criticize what is to take place in Bangui while finding the Queen of England's Jubilee ceremony all right. It smacks of racism." At the end of a state banquet, Bokassa turned to Galli and whispered, "You never noticed, but you ate human flesh," a remark that prompted his reputation for cannibalism. Reminiscing in later years about the coronation, Bokassa told the journalist Ricardo Orizio, "It was the least the French could do to repay me for my services as a soldier fighting for their country, for all the personal favors their politicians received when I became president." The ultimate irony was that less than 2 years after the coronation, as a result of Bokassa's violent conduct, the French themselves felt obliged to step in and remove him from power. What led to Bokassa's downfall started with student demonstrations in Bangui on the 19th of January 1979, in protest at an imperial edict that all pupils buy and wear new school uniforms. The uniforms were manufactured by a textile company owned by members of the Bokassa family and sold exclusively in their retail stores. The demonstrations were joined by crowds of unemployed youths and quickly turned into riots. One of Bokassa's stores was ransacked. The riots were brutally suppressed by the Imperial Guard, but strikes by teachers, students and civil servants continued. In April, after further protests, scores of students were rounded and taken to Mbaragba. One group of 30 students was stuffed into a small cell designed to hold one person. Another group of 20 suffered the same fate. By the time the cell doors were opened the next morning, many were dead. In France, the media dubbed Bokassa the Butcher of Bangui. No longer able to stand the embarrassment of propping up Bokassa's regime, the French, after considerable prevarication, decided to remove him. On the 20th of September, while Bokassa was on a visit to Libya, French troops stationed in Gabon and Chad flew into Bangui, took control and installed David Dacko as president. Among the items they discovered at his residences were several chests full of diamonds, more than 200 cameras and accessories, and a collection of pornography. At the Villa Kolongo they also found 2 mutilated bodies in a refrigerator. One body, with its head, arms and one leg missing, was identified as that of a mathematics teacher. When French troops drained the pond at Villa Kolongo, they came across bone fragments said to have come from some 30 victims eaten by crocodiles. The soldiers were told that other victims had been fed to lions kept in a nearby cage. When pressed by reporters about Bokassa's eating habits, President Dacko readily conceded that human flesh had been a regular item on his menu and had been served on occasion to foreign dignitaries. Bokassa, for his part, always denied charges of cannibalism. Bokassa sought asylum in France, but was turned away. He found refuge instead in the Ivory Coast. At a trial that took place in Bangui in his absence in 1980, he was accused of murder, embezzlement and cannibalism and sentenced to death. After 4 years in the Ivory Coast, he was allowed to settle in his chateau at Hadricourt, west of Paris. In 1986, feeling homesick, he decided to return to the Central African Republic. He was put on trial, found guilty of murder, though not cannibalism, and sentenced to death. The sentence was subsequently commuted, first to life imprisonment, then to 20 years forced labor. In prison he turned to religion, constantly reading the Bible and viewing himself an apostle of Christ. After 7 years imprisonment he was released and spent his last years in Bangui in the Villa Nassa, surviving on a French army pension. He died in 1996, at the age of 75, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Birengo,